Human beings across all cultures and historical periods pray. We typically categorize this behavior as a purely mystical petition to an external deity. But analyzed through modern neuroscience, prayer is an observable, quantifiable technology. We use it for cognitive and physiological self-regulation. The author C.S. Lewis summarized this internal focus perfectly. Prayer doesn't change God, it changes me. A common cultural assumption treats all spiritual practice as inherently beneficial, assuming that any prayer naturally reduces anxiety and improves mental health. Yet empirical research reveals a strict paradox. Certain forms of prayer actively degrade subjective well-being and increase stress. Because the outcomes vary so sharply based on the method, prayer represents a Z-type problem. Efficacy is not dictated by the visible act of praying, but by the hidden variable of its psychological typology and precise neurobiological execution. Researchers quantify these behavioral differences using psychometric tools like the multidimensional prayer inventory. This inventory identifies a distinct category of ego-focused prayers. This includes supplication, confession, and obligatory prayer. The psychological intent behind these acts is highly localized on the self, attempting to extract a favor, alleviate personal guilt, or avoid divine punishment. This correlation matrix measures the psychological impact of those intentions. When researchers plot confession, supplication, and obligation against metrics like optimism and self-esteem, they yield negative or null correlations. The inventory contrasts these with egoless prayers, categorizing them into adoration, thanksgiving, and reception. The mechanics here require pure contemplative presence. The practitioner actively negates their personal desires and anxieties. Looking back at the data, we see a complete inversion. The egoless practices of adoration, thanksgiving, and reception serve as strong positive predictors for well-being and a sense of life meaning. Activating the physiological benefits of prayer requires a mandatory prerequisite, the active negation of the ego. Shifting from psychological intent to physical execution requires looking at the human body as a complex electrical system. Across global contemplative traditions, from Christian centering prayer to Buddhist chanting to Jewish thrice-daily recitations, practitioners utilize one shared physical mechanism, precise rhythmic breath control. Mechanically, diaphragmatic breathing stimulates the vagus nerve. This stimulation triggers parasympathetic dominance. It actively forces the nervous system to exit its fight or flight state. That state of alarm is governed by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal network. In ego-driven anxiety, it commands the body to flood the bloodstream with cortisol. The parasympathetic override generated by rhythmic breathing physically halts the HPA axis, stopping cortisol release from the adrenal glands. This physical suppression of cortisol is the mandatory prerequisite for the brain to begin neurochemical optimization. Cortisol and serotonin operate antagonistically in the human brain. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol actively starve the brain of tryptophan, the essential amino acid required to synthesize serotonin. By dropping cortisol levels, breath-controlled prayer immediately clears the physiological pathway for serotonin production. With the cortisol block removed, structures in the brainstem called the reshape nuclei maximize their synthesis of serotonin. These new serotonin pathways project outward, optimizing networks within the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. This state of elevated serotonin and reduced stress triggers the release of BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF acts as a chemical fertilizer. It prompts neurons to sprout new synaptic connections, a process called neurogenesis. Through this exact sequence, egoless prayer serves as a mechanism to manufacture the proteins required to build new neural hardware. Sustained mental behavior physically alters brain structure over time, a reality known as experience-dependent neuroplasticity. The structural outcome is highly visible. Long-term contemplative practitioners exhibit measurable increases in cortical gyrification, which is the physical folding of the brain's cortex. This increased folding physically upgrades the brain's capacity for executive functions, decision-making, and emotional resilience. We observe these mechanics functioning in real time by placing subjects engaged in deep contemplative prayer into fMRI scanners. This fMRI scan shows intense activity burning in the frontal lobes, representing extreme focus and emotional regulation. But the scan reveals a sharp contrast in the parietal lobes, the brain's sensory and spatial orientation centers. During deep prayer, these parietal lobes are systematically starved of input. They go dark, resulting in a literal loss of the sense of self and physical location. The spiritual feeling of transcendence maps directly to this measurable physiological deactivation. Ancient theological claims state that prayer changes a person's inner nature. The neuroplastic evidence confirms this as anatomical truth. The psychological divide between prayer types dictates this outcome. Ego-focused prayer traps the brain in an HPA axis stress loop, blocking the benefits entirely. The theological concept of prayer as earthly license for heavenly interference translates to the total alignment of personal will with a broader external purpose. This alignment trains the brain out of the localized anxiety of the I and into the interconnected empathy of the we. Prayer generates the empathy and clarity required to navigate the world. This practiced focus on internal executive function replaces the traditional attempt to alter external circumstances through petition. It operates as a highly evolved neurochemical practice. By restructuring our internal architecture, it provides the executive function necessary to navigate and ultimately alter the external world.